In the morning, Diane Whitmore brought a sheriff's deputy to my driveway. She was carrying a clipboard like it was a court order. She stood beside the cruiser in a cream-colored blazer, her HOA badge clipped to her pocket, her lips pressed into the kind of smile people use when they think authority has finally arrived on their side. In one hand, she had a thick manila folder. In the other, she had a printed account statement with a number circled in red, $3,900. That was what she claimed. I owed Maple Creek, not for a broken window, not for property damage, and not for refusing to maintain my house for years. It was for a mailbox she said was the wrong shade of black grass she claimed had exceeded community standards by 2 inches. A plastic trash can that stayed near the curb too long. After a windy night, my pickup truck, sitting in my own driveway, and a small American flag Rachel and I had hung on the porch for Memorial Day weekend. Diane told the deputy I was a repeat violator. She said I had refused lawful HOA enforcement, ignored final notices, and created what she called ongoing visual disorder along the street corridor. Then, she looked at me and said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, rules are rules, Mr. Carter. You do not get to opt out because you don't like being held accountable. I told the deputy this was a civil LHO dispute. It's not something law enforcement could make me pay on the spot. Diane immediately stepped forward, tapped her clipboard, and said, Deputy, we are not asking you to collect money. We are asking you to document his refusal to comply so we can proceed with immediate lien enforcement. Lien enforcement over a mailbox, a truck, a trash can, and a flag. She wanted a police report to make her fake emergency look official to the county recorder. That was when my wife, Rachel, opened the front door. She did not come out angry. She did not raise her voice. She walked down the porch steps with a calm face and a dark blue folder tucked under her arm. Diane barely looked at her, and that was the first massive mistake Diane made that morning. Because Rachel had spent years as an administrative law judge handling code enforcement appeals, municipal fines, notice defects, hearing requirements, and constitutional due process disputes. She understood the exact difference between a valid statutory fine and a paper threat dressed up with a green logo. Rachel listened quietly for maybe 30 seconds while Diane ranted. Then, she asked Diane one simple question: where is the formal hearing record? Diane blinked, her mouth opening slightly but no words coming out. Rachel opened the blue folder and placed the notices on the hood of my silver truck. One by one, there was no proper 14-day cure period. There was no clear rule citation from the declaration. There was no valid board vote recorded. There was no impartial hearing offered. Late fees had been added weeks before the appeal deadlines expired. The fine schedule itself had never been properly adopted under the community bylaws. And a so-called non-compliance escalation charge had been completely invented by Diane through a neighborhood newsletter, not a legally recorded policy. The deputy looked from the papers to Rachel, and then turned his head to stare directly at Diane. Diana's face changed color instantly. Not because Rachel threatened her, she did not. Not because Rachel used her old position to intimidate anyone. She never would. Diane froze because, for the first time in her presidency, someone on that driveway understood the rules better than she did, and by the time our attorney, the property management company, and the rest of the board finished reviewing Rachel's file, that $3,900 fine was gone. Dozens of other resident fines were audited, neighbors got financial credits. The HOA had to rewrite its entire enforcement process, and Diane was permanently removed as president. The internal email where she admitted she wanted to make an example out of us became the document that ended her control over Maple Creek. So before you pay an HOA fine, just because someone with a clipboard says rules are rules, remember this: rules have rules too. And Diane Whitmore was about to learn that the hard way. Rachel and I did not move into Maple Creek looking for a neighborhood war. We moved there because we were incredibly tired. I had spent most of my adult life working maintenance for a heavy manufacturing plant outside Dayton, pulling long hours on bad knees. Rachel had spent years in administrative hearings, listening to people argue over code citations, license permits, and small government decisions that could ruin someone's life if the process was handled badly. When we finally bought the house in Maple Creek, it felt like a place where life might slow down. It was a modest 2-story with a small front porch, a maple tree near the sidewalk. Backyard, just big enough for Rachel's raised beds. The street was quiet, kids rode bikes after school, and most people waved the HOA dues were annoying, but not outrageous. And the rules seem normal enough when we read them before closing. Keep the yard maintained. Do not leave trash cans out all week. Submit major exterior changes. And no commercial vehicles stored on the street. Reasonable stuff, at least on paper. Rachel read the documents more carefully than I did. That was her nature. She checked the declaration, bylaws, fine schedule, architectural guidelines, and hearing procedure. I remember her sitting at the kitchen table before we closed, flipping through pages with a yellow highlighter. I asked, "Are we going to regret living in an HOA?" She looked up and said, "Not if they follow their own rules." For the first year, life was perfectly quiet. We paid our dues, mowed the grass, and Rachel planted tomatoes behind the house. I kept my pickup truck in the driveway because it fit there perfectly, and because the garage held tools and garden supplies. The truck was not commercial. It had no company logo. It was just old, silver, dented near the rear bumper, and useful. The mailbox was black when we bought the house, though over time the sun faded the paint a little. The porch flag was small, and the welcome mat had a sunflower on it. None of it seemed like the kind of thing adults should lose sleep over. Then Diane Whitmore became HOA president. The change was not immediate. At first, she talked about improving aesthetic standards, then curb appeal, then protecting values, and finally restoring Maple Creek's original uniform vision. Those phrases sound harmless until someone starts using them like weapons. Diane had lived in Maple Creek since the neighborhood was built, and she acted like that made her the absolute guardian of everyone else's personal choices. She believed the community had become too relaxed. Mailboxes did not match closely enough. Driveways had too many vehicles. Trash cans appeared too early on trash day, and porch decorations stayed up too long. People had started treating their homes, in her words, like private property, instead of shared visual assets. That phrase bothered Rachel deeply. Shared visual assets. "Our house is not a museum exhibit," she said when she read the monthly newsletter. Diane especially disliked our property. Maybe it was the silver truck, maybe it was the faded mailbox, or maybe it was the fact that I did not rush outside every time she walked past with her little notebook. She preferred people who apologized before knowing what they had done wrong. The first notice we received was labeled a courtesy reminder. It said, "Our mailbox finish appeared inconsistent with Maple Creek standards and should be restored to approved satin black within 14 days. I went outside, looked at the mailbox, and honestly could not tell what offended her. It was black. Maybe not shiny black, but black. I sanded it lightly and painted it anyway to keep the peace. 2 weeks later, we received a formal violation notice, saying the mailbox remained non-compliant because the finish appeared uneven in afternoon light. Afternoon light, that was when Rachel started a folder. She labeled it, HOA Notices, Maple Creek. I thought that was overkill at the time. She said, "No, this is exactly how small problems become expensive. People assume the first notice doesn't matter. Then the paper trail becomes entirely one-sided." She was right. The notices kept coming. Grass height near the sidewalk, trash can visibility after collection day, pickup truck appearance, porch flag placement, and driveway oil stains. Each one came with formal language, deadlines, threats of fines, and references to rules that were either vague, misquoted, or not actually connected to the alleged violation. We responded politely in writing, corrected what made sense, and asked for specific rule citations and photographs. Diane did not like being asked for specifics. She liked obedience. And when obedience did not arrive, she escalated. The first invoice was for $150, claiming we had failed to cure the mailbox violation. Rachel wrote back with dated photos, showing the mailbox had been repainted within the cure period. Requesting that the fine be removed, there was zero response. Then a second invoice arrived, another $150 for grass height. I checked the yard. It had been mowed 3 days earlier. The notice did not include a photo or a measurement. It just said the lawn exceeded community standards. Rachel asked for evidence. No response. Then came the trash can fine, then the truck fine, then the porch flag fine, then late fees, administrative fees, inspection fees, and a charge called non-compliance escalation. That one made Rachel sit very still at the kitchen counter. She read the invoice twice, then pulled out the master HOA bylaws. There is no escalation charge in these documents, she said. I asked. Can they just make one up? She replied, absolutely not. But Diane did. The balance jumped from a few $100s to more than $1,000, then $2,000. Then, finally, $3,900. Every time we requested a formal hearing, Diane or the management company sent back some version of the same automated message. The board has reviewed the matter and determined the fines are valid. But no hearing date was ever offered, no evidence packet was ever provided, and no board minutes identified a vote. No one answered the central question. Rachel kept asking, "What precise process did you follow?" Diane's answer was always the same, "Because I said so." Then came the final demand letter. It said, if we did not pay the full $3,900 within 10 days, the account would be referred to collections, attorney fees would be added, and the HOA would pursue a lien against our property. A lien. That word hits differently when it appears in writing. It does not matter how ridiculous the fine is. Once someone starts threatening title to your home, your body reacts. I remember standing in the kitchen with the letter in my hand, feeling heat rise in my neck. I had worked too many years for that house. Rachel and I had saved too long. And now Diane was trying to turn mailbox paint and a porch flag into a claim against our property. I wanted to march straight to her house. Rachel stopped me before I even reached the door. "No," she said. "We do bruised files clean, so we sent a certified letter. Not emotional, not sarcastic, just facts. We disputed the charges, requested a complete accounting, and requested inspection logs. We also stated clearly that the HOA was not to contact law enforcement to create pressure over a civil collection dispute." Diane responded by coming to my driveway with a deputy. The legal turn officially began on that Saturday morning, when the deputy realized he was being used as a corporate muscle man for an administrative sham. After Rachel laid out the documentation on the hood of my truck, showing the lack of notice and the fabricated escalation fees, the deputy turned to Diane and asked if she had brought a copy of the recorded fine policy or the certified mail receipts showing proper service. Diane adjusted her clipboard, her face tightening, and said that the management company handled the mailing logs and that the board operated under general enforcement discretion. The deputy closed his notebook and said, "Ma'am, this is a private collection dispute, and there is no record of an emergency or a violation of county code here. I cannot document a refusal to comply when the compliance process itself is being legally challenged." He advised both parties to handle the matter through certified mail and left the driveway. Diane stood there for a moment, looking at Rachel with absolute venom, before marching back to her car. The moment the cruiser pulled away, Rachel looked at me and said, "Now we treat this like a hearing file." That afternoon, our dining room table became an evidence room. Rachel sorted every notice by date. She matched each alleged violation to the rules cited, checking whether the covenant actually supported Diane's claims. The mailbox rule required a black mailbox, consistent with community design. It said nothing about satin finishes or afternoon light. The grass rule required lawns to be reasonably maintained, containing no specific height measurements. The vehicle rule restricted commercial vehicles and abandoned cars, neither of which applied to my daily driver pickup truck. The trash can rule allowed cans at the curb on collection day, and our camera footage from that night proved the can had been put away properly before being blown sideways by a 40-mile-an-hour wind gust. Diane hadn't been enforcing the rules. She had been expanding them out of thin air to suit her personal whims. Then Rachel reviewed the mandatory statutory procedure. Under the state HOA law, fines strictly required written notice, a reasonable 14-day opportunity to cure, and an explicit opportunity for a neutral hearing before the fine could ever be finalized or added to an account balance. The board had to formally vote on each fine, and late fees could not be applied while an appeal was pending. Diane's process failed almost every single step. Fines were imposed before the cure periods ended, violation letters failed to identify the specific covenant sections, and late fees were applied prematurely. Rachel requested the official board minutes through the management portal. Several meetings had vague entries like discussion of ongoing violations, but there were 0 votes recorded on our account, 0 evidence logs, and 0 signed decisions. Rachel spent 3 days compiling the data into a master compliance spreadsheet. Each row contained a fine, and each column track listed a required statutory step: notice, rule citation, evidence, cure period, hearing offered, board vote, and appeal deadline. Diane's file failed again and again across every column. We took the spreadsheet to a property rights attorney named Carla Benton. Carla looked over the file for 15 minutes, turned to us and said, "Do not pay them a single dime. These fines are completely procedurally defective, and the email trail suggests targeted retaliation." She immediately sent a formal preservation demand to the HOA board and the management company, legally ordering them to freeze all account activity and preserve every internal communication regarding our property. The first major breakthrough came during the document discovery process. The management company, terrified of being pulled into a lawsuit over a defective collection process, turned over their internal email correspondence with Diane. In one message, a property manager explicitly asked Diane whether our requested hearing should be scheduled before the account was forwarded to collections. Diane had replied, "No, if we give them a hearing, they will use it to argue every technical defect. Keep the pressure on the lien warning." Rachel read the printout and said, "That proves she had actual knowledge that her notices were legally defective. She was intentionally skipping the hearing to prevent her mistakes from being put into the record." The secondary email was even more damning, writing to the rest of the board members. Diane stated, "We need to make an example out of the Carters before other owners start challenging notices and disrupting our enforcement baseline." There it was in black and white, the real purpose behind the $3,900 bill. It wasn't about community aesthetics or property values. It was a calculated intimidation campaign meant to terrify the rest of the neighborhood into absolute submission. Carla used that email to secure an emergency meeting with the HOA's corporate defense attorney, forcing them to sit at a conference table face-to-face with Rachel and her blue folder. During that meeting, Diane tried to remain confident, claiming that executive discretion allowed the board to bypass minor administrative hurdles to ensure community uniformity. Rachel sat perfectly calm, opened her folder, and pushed her compliance spreadsheet across the table, alongside the state due process statute. Rachel went through the fines one by one, pointing out the absolute lack of notice, the lack of photos, the misquoted rules, and the fabricated escalation fees. Then, Carla placed the make an example email directly on top of the pile. The HOS corporate attorney read the message, leaned back in his chair, and rubbed his temples in complete silence. He looked at Diane, then at the management representative, realizing that the association was facing massive civil exposure. Carla looked at the HO attorney and told him plainly, "This isn't just a dispute about $3,900 anymore. Your client has weaponized the collection process, fabricated unauthorized fees, denied statutory hearing rights, and attempted to use law enforcement to intimidate a homeowner. If you attempt to file a lien based on these defective records, we will immediately file a lawsuit for slander of title, breach of fiduciary duty, and civil harassment. Furthermore, we have evidence that dozens of other homeowners have been hit with these exact same illegal escalation fees without ever being offered a hearing." The HOA attorney immediately asked for a recess, pulling Diane out into the hallway. Through the glass door, we could see him gesturing aggressively at the paperwork, while Diane crossed her arms, her face turning bright red. When the meeting resumed, the HOA attorney's tone was completely corporate and submissive. He announced that the board would immediately suspend all collection actions on our account and freeze any lien preparation pending an internal administrative review. He said the enforcement policy would be completely evaluated by his office. Bull, Carla countered firmly, stating that temporary suspension was completely unacceptable. She demanded a full written withdrawal of all fines, complete correction of the account balance to zero, reimbursement for all of our legal fees, and an independent third-party audit of every single fine Diane had issued over the past 2 years. Diane spat out that they were letting a stubborn homeowner destroy the community standards. But the HOA attorney snapped at her to be quiet. She had completely lost the room. The confrontation escalated dramatically on the second Tuesday of the freeze. I was working in my old workshop when the sound of multiple heavy vehicles coming down the private road made me drop my socket wrench. when I stepped outside into the cold morning air. I found 3 large luxury sedans parked unevenly across my grass line. Out stepped 4 men in tailored expensive business suits. Accompanied by Diane's lead defense attorney and a very aggressive representative from the primary mortgage lending bank. They didn't stand near the service path. They marched straight onto my front porch steps, their leather shoes clicking loudly on the old timber boards. The banker held a thick bound folder of escrow printouts and looked at me like I was a hostile criminal, holding a bank hostage. He raised his voice and told me that my refusal to sign the compliance ledger was actively sabotaging the financial stability of the local properties, causing secondary market disruptions, and exposing me to immediate multi-million-dollar tortious interference lawsuits. Diane's attorney stepped forward, placed a gold fountain pen right on my porch railing, and pushed a document toward my chest. He said that if I signed the paper right then and there, the bank would authorize an immediate settlement payout to wipe my balance clean and compensate for the trouble. He looked past me at the old, unpainted siding of my house and whispered that if I didn't sign, they would file an emergency petition before lunch, wrap my title in devastating court injunctions, and ensure that the legal fees alone would take my family home away from me before the year ended. That was when the secondary system camera I had hidden inside the porch ceiling, Eve, did its job. The tiny black lens was focused perfectly on his mouth. I didn't touch the paper. I didn't reach for the gold pen. I simply looked at the banker and asked him whether his underwriting department had bothered to read the certified planning note from the county records office before they approved massive commercial expansion loans for the master developer. The banker blinked, his corporate confidence fracturing for a split second. Diane's attorney tried to pull the paper back, but I kept my eyes locked on the banker's face, telling him that Diane Whitmore had systematically altered the geographic subdivision boundaries on their recent county maps to justify fining properties that were technically outside her original boundary definition. I told them that the entire financial target they were trying to protect was sitting on a mountain of administrative fraud. The banker turned around, looked at the defense lawyer, and demanded to know if they had verified the final recorded plat records. The lawyer stammered, claiming the board operated under broad community covenants. That was when I pointed toward the driveway and told them to get their cars off my grass before I called the state police to document a corporate extortion attempt on a live security feed. They retreated back to their luxury cars so fast one of them dropped his leather folder into the dirt. The public board meeting 2 weeks later was the largest turnout Maple Creek had seen in its history. Word had leaked through the neighborhood grapevine that Rachel had caught the board issuing illegal fines and fabricating fees. Over 100 residents packed into the clubhouse, standing wall to wall and out into the hallway, many holding their own white envelopes and fine notices. People were furious, realizing they had been bullied into paying hundreds of dollars for minor landscaping nonconformities because they had been too afraid of a property lien to fight back. Diane sat at the front table, her posture stiff, trying desperately to maintain her executive image, but her hands were visibly trembling as she adjusted her microphone. Carla Benton stood first, projecting Rachel's compliance spreadsheet directly onto the large projector screen on the wall. She explained to the room that the HOA possessed enforcement power, but that power did not give them immunity from the law. She walked the crowd through the basic legal requirements of notice, cure periods, and neutral hearings. Then Rachel stood up. She spoke with the calm, unyielding authority of an administrative judge. She told the crowd, "An HOA cannot turn due process into a revenue stream, and a board president cannot invent personal fees because someone had the courage to ask for evidence." Then, Carla hit the mouse pad, and Diane's internal email appeared on the wall in giant block letters. "We need to make an example out of the Carters before other owners start challenging notices." The clubhouse completely erupted into shouting. Residents stood up on chairs, holding up their own notices, demanding to know how many of them had been turned into financial examples just to feed Diane's obsession with control. A retired teacher stood up and revealed she had paid $400 in mailbox fines because she was terrified of losing her home. The management company representative tried to claim they were just following board policy. but the crowd drowned him out with boos. To finish the narrative, the HOA attorney called the driveway deputy to the front of the room. The deputy stated plainly for the official record that his office did not enforce civil HOA regulations, that he had been called under false pretenses regarding an aggressive homeowner, and that his physical inspection of the property revealed 0 active violations or safety hazards. He stated that the property owner had been completely cooperative and had presented superior legal documentation on the spot. This public testimony completely shattered the last shred of Diane's credibility. The remaining board members, terrified of a massive class action lawsuit from the residents, voted right then and there to strip Diane of her presidency and freeze all collection actions across the entire subdivision. The official letter from the Maple Creek HOA arrived at our house. 14 days later, Rachel opened the white envelope at the kitchen table while I stood behind her. The statement showed a complete list of every single violation notice, fine, late fee, and administrative surcharge they had applied to our home over the past year. Across the bottom of the page, printed in bold black ink, was a single line that read, "Adjustment to balance, account corrected to 0. The letter formally withdrew every single charge, confirmed that no lien would ever be pursued, and enclosed a corporate check completely reimbursing us for every dollar we had spent on Carla's legal fees. Seeing that 0 balance in black and white felt like taking a deep breath of fresh air after being trapped underwater for months. The wider fallout from Rachel S. Blue folder completely transformed Maple Creek. The independent legal audit uncovered that over 80 separate fine notices issued during Diane S. tenure were procedurally defective and illegal under state property law. The association was forced to issue thousands of dollars in credits and refunds to current and past residents who had been wrongfully fined without a hearing. The entire enforcement guidelines had to be completely rewritten from scratch, ensuring that no fine could ever be applied without documented photographic evidence, a mandatory 14-day cure window, and an absolute right to an impartial appeal board. The property management company, exposed by their own emails for allowing the illegal fines to proceed, had their contract terminated by the neighborhood within 30 days. As for Diane Whitmore, her downfall was absolute. At a special community session held a month later, the homeowners voted by a massive 92% margin to remove her from the board entirely. The email about making an example out of us followed her like a permanent shadow whenever she stepped outside her house. She no longer walked down the sidewalks with her little black notebook and clipboard. Her imaginary authority had been completely stripped away by the very rules she claimed to protect. The neighborhood did not fall apart without her constant surveillance. The grass still got cut, the trash can still went in, and the property values remained perfectly stable, proving that a community thrives on fairness, not fear. Our mailbox is still standing at the end of the driveway, painted a standard black that looks perfectly fine in the afternoon light. My old silver pickup truck still sits proudly on the concrete apron, completely legally. Rachel S. Memorial Day flag still hangs from the porch railing, moving gently in the breeze. Every single time I look out the window and see it, I remember Diane standing there with her clipboard and her circled bill, entirely convinced that her corporate title made her immune to the law. She forgot that an HOA board is bound by the exact same bylaws they use to govern everyone else. That is the ultimate lesson of our story. An HOA can manage common property and enforce legitimate covenants, but it can never be used as a personal weapon to punish dissent. When someone walks onto your property, taps a clipboard, and tells you that rules are rules, you look them in the eye and demand to see the rule that governs their power. Demand to see the notice, the vote, the certified evidence, and the recorded hearings schedule. Because more often than not, the people who are obsessed with controlling your home are the exact same people who forgot to follow the rules themselves. Diane came to our driveway with a $3,900 bill and a sheriff's deputy, but Rachel answered with a blue folder of facts, and in the end, the recorded truth possessed more authority than the clipboard.